Welcome to a lecture on writing and representation. And in this lecture, we'll kind of go through how-to of making observations and in preparation for writing up an ethnography. And this is really to help you get prepared for writing your concert ethnography and for any kind of final paper if you wanted to do an ethnography of a musical group or an ethnography of a musician, etc. This lecture will help kind of walk you through some of the steps and some of the concepts that are important to think about when you're writing about other people. The idea of representation is kind of fraught with difficulty and issues of power and politics and that kind of thing. And so this will kind of walk through a few of the concepts so you can get a grasp of maybe the right way or a way to approach writing about people and their lives. The first kind of term I want you to know is participant observation. And this is kind of a term used in anthropology and a concept and a way of doing observations about, with a group of people or at a concert or in any kind of scene. And it's basically how far you immerse yourself in the scene. So while you'll be doing short-term observations rather than long-term observations, the goals and methods are the same, basically. So in anthropology, there's oftentimes people go and will live in a particular location or with a certain group of people for years on end and really immerse themselves in the culture to get an understanding as a participant in that culture. And yet at the same time, you want to be somewhat removed as an observer. So if you are fully participant in the culture, it's a little difficult to remove yourself and maybe analyze what's going on. And so here's a graph of kind of the range of what you can do as a participant observation researcher. The goal is really to achieve a deeper immersion and get at the meaning and the importance of the activities in which you're involved. And so let's say you're going to a concert to do your concert ethnography. If you go there solely as a member of the audience and you don't think about the paper at all, you'd be falling on the complete participation in that musical event. And at that point, it's a little difficult to keep track of what's going on. Maybe you're not writing notes, etc., etc. So it's challenging to be a complete participant in the events you're trying to describe. And it's also not helpful to be a complete observer. If you're totally detached from the scene, you may not be getting the kind of information about how the music is affecting you or how all these different things about culture are affecting you. So you got to find some balance between participation and observation. And so really, participant observation is a technique of immersing yourself, but not too far into the event or culture or people you're working with. As I said, the range of participation can vary. Complete immersion as an activity is good, but it limits writing kind of your contemporaneous or your field notes. So it's hard to be, like I said, at the concert and completely immersed in the concert itself and not writing notes. And complete observation also limits your deeper understanding that you might gather from some level of participation. So the most important thing about doing observations about a culture or a group of people or even just a simple musical event is that you're not there to present or to uncover the truth or the kind of the generality of how this culture, this group of people, or this event operates. But you're there because there's people, there's multiple perspectives, there's competing perspectives. You, as an ethnographer of a musical event or people or a group of people, are there to really reveal the multiple truths apparent in other people's lives. So understand that there's different perspectives, and as an ethnographer, you are essentially choosing a few perspectives to highlight in the service of creating kind of an understanding of the event or culture that you're working within. So there's some basic ethnographic tools that you'll be using, and we'll talk about the kind of physical tools in the next slide. But the tools you're using are, the first one would be observation. You're there, you're taking notes, you're making memories, you may be making audio or visual recordings, and this is basically you're trying to observe everything you can and take in all you can in different forms. So notes are great because they kind of give you kind of a linear flow of what's happening. Even though you are not able to take in all the information, you're able to maybe select out certain things. So writing notes is great in a notebook when you go out and do these observations. Recordings are great too. They help you go back and revisit the situation. But again, remember the recordings are only a kind of a one-dimensional thing. You can see where the camera's pointing, but you can't see behind the camera. So if you're at a big kind of rave concert, you can see the dancers in front of you, you can't see them behind you. So again, recordings have their limitations. And as well, your memories. Memories are great, and you should definitely try to remember everything you can from your events you're going to observe, but they also have holes. Memories have holes, and they're limited to your observation. So these are tools to use that you need to engage with. The second tool you're going to use is immersion. And so although in this class for the concert ethnography, you won't be immersing yourself for very long, try to immerse yourself as much as you can in the event. So like I said, anthropologists typically go and or ethnomusicologists as well, immerse themselves in a culture for a long time to really get a sense of what the culture is like. So prolonged immersion is important, and so is a reflexive analysis. And we'll talk about reflexivity in a second, but later on in the lecture. But essentially, reflexivity is just understanding your place. Shortly, is understanding your place in how it affects the scene. Another tool you might be able to use is an interview, which you could interview musicians or audience members. It can be a formal, structured interview, or you can just kind of talk to people and let them talk back to you. But basically, you're getting a narrative from specific actors, and that's very useful in terms of putting together detail about certain perspectives from the concert event or the culture you're talking about. You can also have people complete surveys. Surveys are great at acquiring a lot of data, but they're not very great at providing a lot of context for that data or the kind of details that make things interesting. So while surveys are great for certain things, they very much have their limitations. And the kind of final ethnographic tool you could use is analysis, and how you analyze the scene and what happened and the music, etc. That really affects the understanding. That affects your final ethnographic report, which really shapes the view on what happened and shapes what we as readers of your report will understand as kind of a truth from the event or from the people you're studying. There are some other tools you'll be using. Like I mentioned, written notes. Field notes have been incredibly important in the history of anthropology and ethnomusicology. So writing field notes gives you a great way to keep track of the flow of events. It also helps you kind of write down some of your interior thoughts. So you have maybe you're at an event and you mention, oh, everyone seems to be going dancing extra crazy to this one song or whatever it is. You're able to write that down in your notes, and those are super valuable, and you'll go back over those when you start to write up your final ethnography. And in the history of ethnomusicology and anthropology, audio and visual recordings have been absolutely central. As I mentioned before, really the audio recordings really made ethnomusicology as a discipline possible. So definitely try to make audio recordings. Now it's super easy. Before you had to drive around with a truck full of equipment or a backpack full of equipment. Now you can video and audio tape on your phone. It's a very simple thing to do. But again, understanding the limitations of that audio video recording, they're still great tools to use and to employ in your ethnographic research. And another thing I want to just remind you to collect too, especially from your concert ethnography, is flyers or accompanying media from the event. So I found it invaluable to have flyers from events that I've attended. They've really enriched my later writing of ethnographic reports. Flyers or other accompanying media from the concerts you'll be going to do your reporting on are great also to include them in your ethnographic paper. They give a much kind of, in addition to photographs or even videos, since you're submitting things online, flyers really add a kind of richness to your final ethnographic report. So field notes are really the kind of foundation of what you're going to be doing as this participant observer of doing your ethnography. So they inscribe social interaction. They're a discourse that involves selecting important things, quote unquote important, and framing these important things in context. And I put important in quotes on your screen because really they're important to you, but they may not be important to everyone else. And so you're selecting them is also making them important in some senses. So it's important to kind of be aware of what you're selecting and why. The field notes really are a record of the researcher's activity in the field, and they include general observations about the progress of the field work. So if you're staying in someplace for a longer time, you can really talk about how things are going. You can give impressions of interviewees or summaries of conversations, descriptions of the natural environment or the built environment. You can include drawings or diagrams of places. You can talk about lighting conditions during the photography or your videotaping, or the source of extraneous sounds, etc. But really, the field notes are most important for a chronology of what you did during the ethnographic observation. At their very best, they'll kind of form the core of the documentation for your project, and they'll preserve some of your observations and ruminations as your project unfolds, and you can go back to them and include a lot of important things in your final ethnographic report. So I wanted to talk about this concept called thick description, and this is a really kind of important way of approaching ethnographic writing in anthropology and ethnomusicology. But thick description, in a sense, is detailed, context-sensitive, and locally informed description. And what does this mean? What is thin description? I would say thin description, the opposite of thick description, is where you say, I was at the park and I saw two boys, and they both their right eyes twitched, and then a third boy came up and his right eye twitched, and then all three boys left. Like basically, we described three boys, their eyes twitching, but it gives me no information about why. So the difference between, as kind of Gertz and Gilbert Ryle made kind of famous, the difference between a twitch, a blink, and a wink are incredibly different, right? Let's think if somebody is winking, they have, there's a social context, there's a kind of a code, a cultural code behind that wink. It could be conspiratorial, it could be sarcastic, it could be whatever it is, but there's a social context behind a wink. A blink might be just something happens naturally, and there is very little context to it. So the social context and the codes behind actions are super important, and that's what you're trying to get at with thick description. And so by making kind of detailed observations about things, understanding the context of when somebody blinks or winks or whatever, understand that context and trying to get at the meaning behind these actions is the important thing you're trying to get with thick description. You're basically trying to understand the social codes, the cultural context, and the local meaning. Meaning, if you're in a different culture, local meaning will have something different than our culture here from America. But even in the context of the blink and wink story, kind of the locally informed description would be understanding the context, what context the boys are winking or blinking in, and understanding their meanings behind it. So the idea of thick description is to describe an event in an attempt to get to understand some of the truth and or meaning behind the actions. So this will play out in your concert ethnographies quite a bit. Let's say you're going to a rock concert, is the lead guitarist kind of gyrating on his guitar? Is that just the way he plays? Does he play gyrating on his guitar, or does that have some kind of cultural context to it, some kind of like code behind it? And so all these things will play into your observations, your ethnographic observations during your concert report, and possibly for your final paper. So the idea of describing detailed, context-sensitive, and locally informed description is central to what you'll be doing, really. In terms of writing field notes, there are some things to think about that inform the writing of your field notes. That the first one is that data and findings are inseparable from your observation. So basically what this is saying is that what you're observing, you're only observing a slice of the action, but what you're writing down as this data, observations, and findings, that you can't you can't divorce that from observation. So by linking your data and your methods of collecting to an understanding of your position as an observer, this kind of encourages the view that the events experienced are not at the absolute, or not the big capital V truth, but they're just one account from one position. So it kind of positions you in the field and helps us understand the kind of multiplicities of truth out there. The second thing is you have to give a special attention to indigenous meanings or concerns. I mean, what does it mean to them? Or the indigenous meanings help remind us that the point of the ethnography is not to uncover what the researcher sets out to uncover, which would invariably kind of skew the importance of things we're studying. But the kind of giving attention to indigenous meanings or concerns helps uncover a more complete understanding of the reality of the lives of your observations, of your research participants, of your interlocutors. So let's give an example of that. What does giving special attention to indigenous meaning or concerns mean for you? Let's say you're going into your concert ethnography, and you have a set goal of what you want. You come in here as a researcher, and you want to understand kind of the meaning of, let's say you want to understand the meaning of gender at this concert, because you're going to see a group of females performing on stage, and you want to see how gender influences their performance and how the audience kind of makes it up. That's important. That's an interesting angle of taking your ethnographic observations. But if you're doing that and ignoring kind of the meaning that your concert is, or the meaning of your musicians in your concert, or the audience members, the meaning of what you ignore their meaning or their concerns, then you're missing out on quite a bit of the importance of the event to your participants and to the band members, to the audience members, etc. And so making sure that you kind of foreground the concerns and or meanings that the audience and the band members give you gives you a more complete account, rather than kind of exerting your authority over the observations. The third thing that's important in writing of your field notes is that contemporaneously written field notes really ground your observations, and they provide a resource for writing more coherent accounts at a later time. So rather than kind of going to an event and observing and then afterwards writing all your notes, that's inevitable in some cases, but it's much better to write notes during the events, during the observations, right then. And this really helps avoid kind of the flatness of generality that comes with kind of after the fact recollections. And so what happens oftentimes, if you try to save all that note writing till the very end, you say, oh, that was important, and you're making connections from different instances during the event, and you say, well, in general, that's what happened, and you kind of generalize. And what it does is it takes a lot of the richness and detail. It may take out some of even the contradiction that you saw and observed if you had written contemporaneous notes. That kind of after the fact recollection really kind of dulls out your whole ethnography. And really the purpose of writing ethnography is not to come to some grand general understanding of the scene or of human culture, but kind of highlight the interactional detail and help preserve these processes and details of witnessed events. And that really brings us to the last thing here on writing field notes, is that field notes should detail the social and interactional processes that make up everyday lives and activities. And so as much as you can during your observations, what you want to do is help preserve some of the detail and the context of the event. So while you won't be spending a lot of time living with, a culture or a village, etc., for years, like a kind of more traditional anthropology, what you want to do is not ignore the everyday details, that make up the activities and lives of your participants. And so if, let's say you're at a concert, let's say you're at a rock concert, if you only focus on the sound and the stage, and you ignore kind of the processes of, people going to get a drink, or people going to the bathroom, or, this person's throwing up, or whatever it is, if you ignore those other details, you're missing out a lot in terms of the context and the meaning of the event to a lot of people. So your observations shouldn't just be about the formal aspects of the event, but should include all of the kind of everyday mundane aspects of going to a concert, really. And writing field notes is really the first step in what you'll be doing later as interpreting, textualizing, and creating life on the page when you write your ethnography. So your ethnography is really going to be an attempt to recreate, in a sense, the event you witnessed, or the kind of the culture you've been living with. Recreate that on the page and make it alive enough for us as readers to experience and understand it in a deeper way. So we've talked about notes and kind of the processes of writing field notes and making observations, but I want to talk about when you're writing your ethnographic report of the concert, or of anything, any anthropological or ethnomusicological ethnographic report. There are kind of 6 things that really influence the writing of that ethnography. So the 6 things are both outside, external and internal influences. And it's important to keep these kind of forces in mind when making your observations and crafting any ethnography. So you can attend to how they might shape or alter the ethnographic account, or how these forces change the nature of the ethnography, and thus change how your audience, your readers, understand your subject and the people that you're writing about, or the music or the events you're going to. In effect, these forces kind of direct and shape our understanding of what is true, and thus should be really thought about with a lot of care. So the first way ethnographic writing is determined is contextually. So ethnographic writing draws on and creates meaning from social interaction and from the social scene. So we really have to provide context. So everything in ethnography is basically all about providing context for the actions that you've described. Ethnographic writing is determined rhetorically because there are certain expressive conventions that we use and that other people use in describing certain things. And so there are certain expressive conventions for describing sound, for instance. And so we have in our culture, a very kind of, we have a certain way of describing sounds in terms of their timbre, their loudness, etc. And different people may experience sound differently and thus describe it differently. And so how you these expressive conventions really change the way people see an event or a culture. For example, I've heard that the kind of Inuit in Alaska, the kind of Native Americans in the north, have a much wider description, much wider variety of the color white than we would. So if you go out into the kind of frozen north and you see snow and you say, it looks white. But if you talk to an Inuit or Native American from Alaska and Canada, their description of that scene is much more nuanced because they live in that scene all the time. And so their expressive conventions determine how they describe the scene, just like ours do. Our limitations on the kind of levels of whiteness of that kind of frozen landscape determine that as well. The third way that ethnographic writing is determined or influenced is institutionally. And so you and all ethnographers write in and for and against traditions, disciplines, and audiences. So this really shapes how ethnographies are written. So in your case, as student ethnographers in a class in the university, you're writing to kind of fulfill the requirements of the paper, right? And so that is kind of a tradition and an audience that you're writing to, and that will shape how your ethnography comes out. Other ethnographers who are writing kind of professionally, like people have already
are doing research and have done their PhD, they're writing for, to get tenure at the university, and that'll change how they write as well. And really different traditions or disciplines write about different events, write about events differently. So an anthropologist will write slightly differently than an ethnomusicologist than will a sociologist, even if they're all seeing the same event. So the discipline you're writing from also influences your final ethnographic report. The fourth way that ethnographic writing is determined or influenced is generically, right? So ethnographic reports are a very specific genre of writing, and like an ethnography is very distinct from a novel. So a novel can go on flights of fancy and really have a variety of forms and ways of approaching passing on information. While as an ethnographic report has to kind of stick to certain conventions to keep it within the kind of realm of academic honesty and kind of truthfulness as far as we know. Generically, an ethnography is different than a travelogue. So a travelogue is a great way of exploring a different place and a different culture, but it doesn't have the same conventions that an ethnographic report would have. The fifth way that ethnographic writing is determined is politically. So an ethnography represents the intentions, beliefs, and practices of the people described in the text, and also the intentions, beliefs, and practices of the person who's writing the text. And so this kind of power of representation, which is held by the ethnographer, is really unequal. The person who's writing, namely you, have the power to really shape our understanding of that concert that you're going to go attend. And so there's a lot of kind of power and representation and unequal levels of power in writing about a scene and presenting it as one of the kind of multiple truths, right? Now and in the past, ethnographies have always been politically positioned. And so you've had certain ethnographies that are written with an aim of kind of advancing the cause of the people who the ethnography is about. Say like the certain groups in Africa or India, and the ethnographer is attempting to kind of help them out, advance their causes, in contrast to like maybe a big multinational corporation putting a dam on their land and on their river, right? So there's a lot of political motivation behind writing ethnographies, but even down to kind of personal politics, the way you write about and the way you even make your observations of a scene or a culture are motivated by your politics as a human being, really. And finally, the last thing that influences ethnographic writing is really history, right? All the above things change, and if we wanted to go have an entire course on ethnographic writing in anthropology and ethnomusicology, we could spend an entire 15 weeks talking about how each one of these forces influencing ethnographic writing has changed over time. And not just change, it's still changing. So all of these factors I've just talked about change as time passes and as societies and cultures continue to move around. I wanted to mention a concept or a couple concepts that are really important as well when you keep in mind when you're doing your observations, when you're doing your writing. And this is the idea of reflexivity. There's a couple different ways of understanding this concept. Understanding how you impact the scene as a researcher in there is really important. So if you're going to a small intimate concert, your position in that performance or your kind of you being there actually influences the actions of other people around you. It's also really important to understand that if you're doing this, especially as an interviewer, if you're interviewing somebody, your actions, the way you ask questions, etc., will influence the answers they give you. And so understanding your role in how you impact the scene is important to kind of understanding the information you're getting, and that will give you a much better or kind of more thorough understanding of the kind of reality of the situation if you know that you are impacting the scene as even just by your mere presence or how you're asking questions. A second way of understanding reflexivity is that your focus, let's say you're going into a performance and you want to discuss the idea of music and gender or something like that, understand that focus and your focus at the time of making the observations will color your perspective about what happened. So if I'm looking at music and gender, I go to a performance and I'm going to kind of make certain observations and make my notes about certain things that are on that focused on that idea particularly. If I go in there and I want to talk to the same performance and I want to have a different focus, I want to talk about music and capitalism, or say, I'll be writing down different notes. And so in the end, if we imagine the same performance is observed by two identical researchers, and they, but with different foci, then you're going to come out with two different sets of notes, and we're probably going to have two different types of papers, just because you've entered into the situation with a different analytical focus. And so understanding how that also colors your observations and the kind of information you generate out of your ethnographic observations is crucial to understanding kind of again the reality of what actually took place. And secondly, or even thirdly, really, you need to recognize that, especially in musical performances or creative performances, what people are doing on stage and what people are doing in the audience can actually provide commentary on themselves. It might be parody, it might be expressing something conscious that kind of affirms or rejects history or traditions and the acts of practices. And so knowing that what people do can actually be reflective of a history that you need to also understand. So let's say somebody is making a joke on stage. If you have to kind of recognize that it's obviously generally obvious it's a joke on stage, and you can kind of see that, but it might be referencing other material that that would kind of add some depth to your observations if you knew the back history of that. And so understanding that people and performers and audience members can be conscious and provide commentary on themselves is another kind of variety of reflexivity that we should be aware of. And so in doing your observations, you need to be alert to the ideas of sarcasm or parody or even humility or false humility that people are projecting out there. And again, understand that really changes the meaning of their actions. And again, the whole idea behind ethnography is to kind of understand the meaning or symbolic meaning or all these meanings behind the actions that you're observing. So when you're making observations, again, keep all these things in your mind. Keep in mind the idea of reflexivity, and again, how you're changing the situation at being there in person, and also how the performers can be commenting on their own past and own history, and also how your focus, what you're actually trying to glean out of the observations, will also color your report, your kind of paper at the end of it, and really shift or at least color how we understand that situation. There's another term that I would like to discuss. It's called dialogic editing, and you may or may not be able to do this. I think it's an important and really useful tool, and if you're able to complete this, it'd be great. If not, it's understandable because you're not necessarily immersed in the event or the culture for a very long time. But dialogic editing is basically returning to your interlocutors or your people who you interview, people who you interact with, your kind of research participants, returning to them once you've written your ethnography and giving their feedback. So in a sense, what you're doing is you go observe, you make your observations, you make your analysis, you write your ethnography, and once it's basically in its finished state, you go back to the people who you worked with and get their feedback on it. And this can add enormous value and really accuracy in your account. But it also has to be taken with the same critical eye as your observations, as your editors or the former research participants. They still have motives and personal and political beliefs that they want to shape. They want to shape the narrative in ways that fits their needs. And so there needs to be a balance between the kind of insider, outsider, objective and subjective view, even though we're never really completely objective or completely an outsider, etc. But it's a technique, maybe especially if you're going to be interviewing people if you have band members and you're doing kind of ethnographic report or musicians that it might be really useful for you to bring the paper back to them and have them just glance over it and see if they agree. It's also really kind of, it can be very empowering. It can also be very nerve-wracking, really, because you've made all these what you think are astute observations, and you're coming back to the source of these observations and asking for feedback, and it can be challenging, especially if they disagree with how you've analyzed the situation. But it makes your full ethnography that much more rich if you're able to complete some sort of dialogic editing. So now we have to turn to one of the big elephants on the internet, which is really the development of these text generators, AI, artificial intelligence text generation, like ChatGPT and things like that. They can be really impressive tools to use, and I think want to make sure you and encourage you to use some of these tools effectively. But I want to also talk about some of the drawbacks of using them too much. One of the main issues that I have with using over reliance on ChatGPT and things like that is that you're missing out as a student for development, and that's really important. That's what this whole class is about: is developing your brains and getting you to be more creative, more interesting thinkers, and showing you the things out there in the world and having you make connections and learning new things. And using ChatGPT really kind of eliminates that process. Writing itself, especially ethnographic writing, is really a process for learning. It's not just generating information. It's not just spitting out textbook answers. When you sit down, you make your observations when you're out in the field, then you sit down with your notes and you're editing, you're synthesizing, you're kind of putting things together creatively. And through this process, you're becoming a scholar, you're becoming an expert through writing. And so writing is much more than just synthesizing information. It's a process of discovery. It's a process of becoming. And that's what's so vital about it. And that's what the kind of over-reliance on ChatGPT and things like that is stripping away from you. AI text generators really spit out textbook style answers. They don't really create anything new. Obviously, they're trained on a huge amount of data, which can be impressive and sound like it's creating something new. But in reality, it's really synthesizing existing information, which can be helpful. But really, especially with ethnographic writing, you're writing about new observations, you're writing about the things you just saw on the field work you just did. You're uncovering new patterns and making connections that might show that that your observations and your analysis might fit with existing patterns or ideas or not. But it's a process that you have to kind of uncover through the act of writing. Once you've done your observations and you write down what your ethnographic report effectively, revising that writing is really crucial to improving the quality of your thinking, and improving the connections you can make with existing knowledge, and integrating your new observations with that. AI writing tools can lead to a loss of creativity and really misses the opportunity to develop your analytical and creative thinking muscles. I posed this question to ChatGPT about ethnographic writing, and their answer is fairly instructive. So I want to give you a quote of what it wrote back to me. It said, quote, "Another potential drawback of using ChatGPT in ethnographic writing is that it may undermine the authenticity and individuality of a student's voice. Ethnographic writing is meant to be a reflection of the researcher's own experiences and perspectives, and relying too heavily on ChatGPT may result in writing that feels impersonal or lacking in nuance." End quote. And I think this answer is great. It's technically correct. It's really well written, but it also demonstrates the exact issues the AI system is talking about. It's mentioning that it's lacking in personality and nuance. And it's also contradicted. I didn't quote it, but it's actually contradicted earlier in the paragraph where the AI system said ChatGPT could help students develop more nuanced writing. And so this really demonstrates that the information it generates, or these text generators, can be internally contradictory or even false. And I found that actually, if you're asking specific questions of these text generators, they're oftentimes false, especially when you're dealing with music and more kind of nuanced things like that. So just kind of sum up what I just said is that writing is a process. It's a process of discovery. It's a process of becoming. And an over-reliance on these text generators, while it can be helpful in certain instances, you're missing out on that process of becoming. And so I would really be cautionary in using these tools. That said, they can be really helpful in many ways, and so I want to discuss a few of them. ChatGPT is one of them, which might be helpful for answering questions that you may have, and especially if you are double checking that it's actually true and factually correct. There's some other tools out there. One is called Elicit, Perplexity AI is another one, and Explain Paper is a third one. These are great. Elicit can actually give you some answers to questions and give you links to articles or research papers. I've asked it a few questions and I come up with some interesting, linked papers that you can go then kind of further your research with. One problem I found with these systems also is that oftentimes it'll glean things from the web, and it's not generally the papers that are the kind of answers or the links it's giving you are not necessarily scholarly papers, are oftentimes more kind of news-like articles, and so you get a kind of over a number of kind of general website answers rather than kind of the more scholarly papers you'd find on places like JSTOR and things like that. So it might be helpful in the initial stages of your research to use tools like Elicit and Perplexity AI to kind of further your research. But I would certainly say you need to go beyond that in the process of doing your ethnographic writing. Explain paper is another tool. If you're reading a fairly complex article, you can upload like a PDF of the article, and it can maybe help. You can highlight the areas where you're not quite sure what's going on, if it's the complex language or complex ideas, and we can break it down and maybe explain it a little bit simpler. Again, I've checked these out, and the answers it gives are reasonably simpler, but there's not a whole lot of. It's not really kind of simplifying the complex ideas very much. It's making them slightly less wordy, maybe using a little simpler language, but it's not going to really kind of break apart ideas in a way that might be more helpful to you. So again, I wanted to say, use the tools that are out there, use ChatGPT, Elicit, Perplexity AI, all these other tools out there, but I would not rely on them for the reasons I've mentioned before, that writing in itself is a process of discovery, editing, analyzing, making these connections is a process of you growing as a person, as a scholar, as a student, etc. And again, these tools strip that away from you, and you're not able to progress as much. But that said, don't be afraid of them. They can be very helpful in the beginning stages of your research, and I would encourage you to go to use them, and also to cite when you do use them. Actually, be really helpful if you're writing papers to say, this information was found through these different programs. It would be helpful for me, and also probably helpful for other people in the future. And I just want to talk about a little bit about, we've mentioned several of these things, but ethnography and representation is really fraught with ethics and issues. Kind of at its roots, ethnography has a lot of roots in kind of the colonialism. Europeans would go out to their territories and write reports about the natives, and this kind of unequal power dynamic really caused a lot of problems in the early days. But it's been, I think, as ethnomusicologists and anthropologists and people who do ethnographies, there's been a lot of thought and debate and movement towards trying to decolonizing the way we think about ethnography. But really, ethnographers in the past were sent out by colonial authorities to kind of better understand and catalog the colonized land and people. In some ways, anthropology still bears these scars, like the kind of white or foreign ethnographer going to someplace far away or exotic and coming back with kind of heretofore unknown information. It's still kind of a thing. I mean, really, I'm almost an example of that. I would, as a white male from America, going to India and talking to all these mothers and grandmothers about their lullaby practices with their children, it has kind of echoes of this kind of colonial anthropology, colonial ethnography that was practiced before. But like I said, thankfully, there's been a lot of thought given to the ethical responsibilities of ethnographers. But there needs to be kind of a continuing awareness about the past problems. One really important thing for you to think about ethically and for writing ethnographies and for you becoming the representer or you writing something that becomes a representation of a person or an event or a culture is that you're developing a lot of trust with those you interact with. They trust you to represent their side, and you trust them to be open, neither of which can really always occur for a variety of reasons. So, for example, you might have motives that differ from those with whom you work. Is there money involved? Do they have political motivations to tell their story versus that of their rival? Or do you have, let's say you go to a concert, if you're interviewing musicians, do they have motivations to kind of set the story straight in contrast to some of the bands they're competing against, or in contrast to their record label, etc. So political motivations always color our understanding and our kind of representation of ourselves and others. Do you have motivations? To understand some aspect of their society, and you're working around the margins of, or trust needs to be gained on both sides, really, and it's not always easy to do or to keep, but it's really important and something you need to think about when you're doing your research. And ultimately, there's the issue of power, and we've talked about power in several contexts in different lectures, but you as an ethnographer, you're the one who will write the story of the event or the people. they and you hold enormous power to shape that narrative of the people, event, and culture. So really referring back to those 6 ways ethnography is determined, the politics surrounding the ethnographer and your research participants and the institutions surrounding the reception and or support of your ethnography really influence the final product. And so that's something you really have to be attuned to, that you have enormous power in telling a story that may not be told otherwise. And I'm making a big deal out of this, even though you're probably going to be going to one concert, doing your ethnography on that concert. It's not necessarily as fraught as it may seem, but these are still issues. So, if you write something about a concert or a musician or an audience member that they don't agree with, you still have that power to write that, and that's really important to remember. And so it's really important to kind of be true to yourself and really attempt to write as thick descriptions as you can to kind of frame and ground and contextualize what you're talking about. The hard part as an ethnographer is that you're looking for meaning behind actions, meaning as presented in symbolic actions. But this is hard to do and nebulous to see, and it's hard to understand. It's hard to represent in your ethnography. So the ethnographer has a really fine line to walk, balancing the challenges of observation, the needs of uncovering and expressing indigenous meaning, and the desires of the community you're studying, and the needs and biases that you have as an ethnographer and the audience who's reading your ethnography. So all these issues of power, the issues of representation, are really important to think about, even at this small level of going out and doing a concert ethnography. They influence all of this. And if this is something you enjoy and you want to be go into writing more ethnographies, go into anthropology, go into ethnomusicology, it's very important to think about the issues surrounding representation of a people, a culture, event, and the power you have as an ethnographer to shape that. So just to recap to the kind of very word-dense lecture I just gave you. I'm sorry, this is a lot of talking and not a lot of music, and I hope that will change the next lecture. This is kind of a how-to. But the first one is you have to find a balance between participation and observation. The idea of participation really gives you a deeper sense of meaning of the event you're going to see, but you need to find a balance between complete participation and complete observation. Keep in mind all the ethnographic tools I mentioned, not only the kind of field notes, the recordings, the memory, but also the tools you have, all the tools you have at your disposal. When you write your ethnography, be very attuned to understanding the kind of local meaning, the context of what you're writing about. So really write with kind of thick description in your mind. You're not writing just about the event started at 9 p.m. There were 500 people there. Everyone danced. Everyone got drunk, and they went home. You really are trying to find the meaning behind these actions. And so by using this idea of thick description of local contextualized information, you can find some of the meaning behind the actions. And that's the important point about writing an ethnography. Be alert to the forces shaping your observations and the ethnography. So understanding politics, understanding how institutions, understanding how rhetorics or expressive modes of writing and speaking all influence what we observe and how we write is super important in terms of crafting an ethnography that's convincing and that is closer to the one of the slices of truth that you're observing. Be reflexive in your account, so understand your position, what you bring as an ethnographer to the scene, what your biases may be, what your motivations may be for being there, and also the kind of reflexivity of the event you're seeing. Is it parody? Is it commentary on itself, etc.? But be reflexive, but don't be so reflexive that you're just navel gazing for the entire ethnography, meaning you're just writing about your experience at the event, and the ethnography then all of a sudden becomes only about you and your issues. You can't go that far in your reflexivity. So make sure you're reflexive enough, but not to the point of absurdity. And Also, continually remember that you wield an enormous amount of power as an ethnographer. You're writing about an event, you're writing about people, and you're basically presenting a slice of what you see as truth, and that you have enormous power in that representation. And so it's kind of a burden you have to bear and kind of think about all the time to make sure you're being fair, you're being honest, and you're presenting things as well as you can see and analyze them. So again, I apologize for all the talking. Next lecture we'll be talking more about kind of the roots of ethnography and colonialism and Orientalism in music, etc. So I will see you next lecture. Thank you.